And now we'll have Caitlin Frankish that will show us the year-round energetics of North Atlantic seabirds.
My name is Caitlin Frankish, and I'm a postdoc at the Norwegian Polar Institute working on the Seatrack project. And today I'm going to talk to you very briefly about energetics of North Atlantic seabirds. So I'd like to start by highlighting that the data I'm going to talk to you about today is the result of a massive collaborative and funding effort through the Seatrack program, and I am just a mere postdoc who gets to analyze a fantastic data set. So throughout the year, animals like seabirds are expected to adjust their behavior in order to survive changing environments, but also so they can undergo different life history events such as breeding or molt. And one of these behavioral adjustments can be to change one's distribution in time and in space. And thanks to tracking programs such as Seatrack, in the North Atlantic, we have an increasing understanding of where a lot of different seabird species go. And as you can see from the density maps on the left produced by colleagues at Seatrack, this group of animals not only covers a huge area, but they also show distinct patterns in time and space as to where they concentrate. However, our understanding of the processes underlying these patterns, as you all know, is not as great, especially as how they might relate back to varying fitness or diverging population trajectories across the colonies which are involved. Energetics, however, is suggested as a field that might offer us a bit more mechanistic insight into some of these topics, as it can relate internal physiology to the external environment and variation in behavior at an individual level, thus providing us with the opportunity to gain a bit more understanding as to what it costs individuals to be in different areas and thus what might motivate them to go there and why they might fare more or less better in different areas. So to gain a better understanding of what's happening at this scale, we thought we'd take the opportunity to combine the large amount of biologging data which is available in the Seatrack dataset with published energetic equations to estimate year-round activity budgets and related energetic costs for several species of seabirds in the North Atlantic. And we did this basically to try and get a better understanding of what it takes for these birds to make it through an entire year. We were also interested in scaling this process up to a population level using Seatrack density maps to better understand how energy costs might vary in time and space across the North Atlantic. To do this, we focused on 6 species of pelagic seabirds: northern fulmar, black-legged kittiwake, little auk, vernix, and common guillemot, and Atlantic puffins. These species are very numerous, but they also differ in terms of their flight and foraging costs, so we might expect them to differ in their energetic strategies. And the data I'm going to talk to you about today comes from the colonies in red, but the aim is to expand it to the colonies in yellow, which are more in the Northwest Atlantic. And so, building on previous work, we combined immersion data from geolocators and geolocator positions to estimate first time that these different seabird species spent in 4 to 5 different behaviors. To do this, we created 2 behavioral decision trees, one for the 4 auk species and one for fulmars and kittiwakes, which, as you know, differ quite a lot in their flight and foraging strategies, which we thought would be kind of presented in the underlying biologging data. And then, as has been previously done, for every 10 minutes of immersion data, we allocated it to an activity based on a series of questions such as, how wet is the bird? How close is the bird to the colony? What time of the year is it? And so forth. And then, in contrast to what has often been done in the literature, we tried to incorporate a bit of variability in our allocation process to try and better reflect the uncertainty in the information we have at our disposal. So for instance, if in the literature we found that there is a variety of thresholds used to differentiate between behaviors, we tried to incorporate a range of these. And for instance, to determine whether a bird could have been at its colony or not, we tried to incorporate error around geolocator positions and so forth. And then we associated energetic costs to each of these activities using all the studies which are shown on the left. And from this, we got estimates of monthly energy expenditure for all individuals in our data set. So this is just an example for a fulmar from Alkifjellet, which is on Svalbard. And the predictions run from July through to June, so winter is in the middle. And we ran these calculations many times per individual, which resulted in mean estimates of confidence intervals, which tries to incorporate this uncertainty I mentioned before. And this methodology is very much in progress, so if you have any thoughts or comments, I'd love to chat afterwards. So at a species level, this methodology reproduces nice temporal variation in activity budgets. So what you can see on the y-axis is proportion of the month spent in different behaviors, and it's color-coded according to the species. So you can see, for example, I don't know if there's a laser on this. No. In the middle of winter, the birds are, for instance, all leaving land, which you would expect. And for kittiwakes, for instance, you can see distinct migratory periods just after and before the breeding season. And this, in combination with temporal variation in experienced sea surface temperature, which is included in thermoregulation in our energy equations, we got nice predictions of energetic expenditure, which also varies over time. And what you're looking at here is mean predictions for the 6 species across all colonies, and energy expenditure is scaled between 0 and 1 on the y-axis. And I'll just draw your attention to the fact at the moment, energy costs seem to be peaking at slightly different times of the year for the 6 species, which might have implications for when they're most vulnerable to mortality. So that'll be interesting to look a bit more into going forwards. If we zoom into what's happening at a colony level, there's also evidence for spatial variation in energetic costs, which you might expect. So here I've just quickly summed energy costs across the non-breeding season, and I've plotted it against colony latitude. And fitting simple regressions suggest that the more north your home is, the more energy you're expending, which might be related to birds being heavier or being in colder waters. This is also something I'd like to look into more going forwards. But more generally, because of these nice temporal and spatial patterns we were finding at an individual level, we thought it'd be interesting to scale this up. And to do this, we used estimates of sea surface temperature covering the North Atlantic, which looks a bit like this in the winter. And using this, we recalculated energetic costs for every species colony combination in our data set. So this looks a bit like this. For a northern fulmar, again from Alkifjellet, which is on Svalbard. This is in December. And basically this shows that for an average individual, the more north they are, the more energy they're expending. So we then multiplied this by the number of birds, which were predicted to be in every cell in our map, which is from these sea tract density maps I mentioned earlier. And we get predictions of energetic costs, which are instead now predicted to be up here to the northeast of their colony. So essentially, population level costs are a product not only of the thermal environment in which they are in, but of what they're doing at that time of the year and where they are, of course. So why is this interesting? Many reasons, but I'll just give you one example today of something I'd like to pursue further. So from these energetic costs, we can back calculate how much prey this group of birds might have to extract from the marine ecosystem in order to meet these energetic costs, and thus gain an idea of the magnitude of one of the ecological roles they serve in this area. And so here I've done a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation of what this might represent. And just for comparison purposes, I've also plotted an estimate of mean annual forage fish exploitation by fisheries in the Northeast Atlantic. And what's kind of cool is that moving forwards, thanks to these energy cost maps we've made, we can derive new ones of where prey consumption might occur, using estimates of assimilation efficiency and prey energy density. And this is just an example for these birds in the winter. And moving forwards, what's kind of exciting is that together with maps of where fisheries catch occurs, we might be able to resolve a bit more in detail than what is previously done in time and space, where these two actors might overlap with one another and potentially compete with one another or not. So just to wrap it up, we're trying to estimate year-round activity and energy budgets for 6 species of seabirds in the North Atlantic. Preliminary results indicate that there are temporal and spatial trends in energy costs that will be quite exciting, I think, to dive into. So for instance, we showed that colony latitude might play a role in driving some of this, but I'd be quite keen to investigate the role that other drivers might play, such as migratory distance. Now, I think it'd be quite cool to investigate whether there's evidence for trade-offs. So for instance, if an individual has a costly strategy, is it compensating for it by going somewhere where there's more food? We're also trying to scale this process up to the North Atlantic, using sea track density maps to better understand in time and space how these energy costs might vary. This is useful as it can help us understand the magnitude of some of the ecological roles that seabirds play in this area, such as predatory pressure, but it could also be used to understand a bit more in time and space where this group of birds might be vulnerable to threats such as displacement from offshore wind farms, for example, which is very topical at the moment, and make sure to listen to Leila Buckingham's talk on this later today. And I'd just like to finish by shamelessly plugging SeaTrack. If you're interested in hearing more about this, Benny has a poster later today, and Vega will be giving a talk about herring gulls. And finally, SeaTrack is hiring a new postdoc. The deadline's next week. So if you'd like to be my new friend, you can scan this QR code and find out more about it or track down Benny. The topic is identifying and mapping the distribution of prey, seabird prey in the North Atlantic. Great. Thanks for listening.
Questions?
Thanks, Caitlin. That was really cool to hear about. I'm over here. I was just wondering whether you've got any data within the SeaTrack database that includes loggers from birds that died and didn't survive throughout the annual cycle, and whether you've been able to look into their time activity budgets and what might have happened to their energy expenditure.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. Do you have any loggers that you've been able to get back from birds that didn't survive the annual cycle, and have you been able to look into that data at all?
That's a really good question. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I imagine there must be some, but I'm not sure if the sample size is large enough to make any inferences. Have to ask someone who's been in the project for longer, I think.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
And that would be super interesting, I think, to look into for sure.
Okay. If I remember rightly, most of the birds seem to crash in their energy or really drop down in February. And I wondered what happened in February, because in my head, February is still quite a cold month. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you go back through it.
Yeah, so it's actually starting to go down a lot more, what was I going to say, across the breeding season. But you're right, there is a dip for a lot of them in February. And I think it's probably related to them resting on the water rather than being active, which has a lower energetic cost than the equations we're using. But to differentiate between those two behaviors, the threshold, I guess, could be revisited. But I think that's what's happening here. So yeah, in February, it looks like they're resting more in the water than being active, which, yeah, is just more costly in the budget we're using.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks, really enjoyed that. Some fantastic data set and analyses. I was just wondering what your perspective, having looked at all those papers that have done time activity budgets and tried to sort of, I think, take a species approach at the moment, drawing on those, but do you sense there's a consistency across these different algorithms that people are using that could allow us to build towards some sort of consistent approach, allowing for multi-species analyses, species that we haven't studied so closely, or are we all just going to stick with bespoke, slightly awkward, species-specific approaches?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think in terms of the energetics, there was a super nice paper that came out last year by Ruth Dunn et al. That offered the framework to follow, which provided recommendations of costs to choose if your species of interest didn't have any published ones in the literature. And we've tried to follow that actually here for FOMAS. So I think that's already a great first step towards trying to streamline all of this. And I think it'd be super cool if something similar could be done for activity budgets. And maybe there's room to do that here with a methodology paper. We've chatted a bit about it, but yeah, I think that would probably be quite useful to try and put this all together.
Thank you, Caitlin. And now Quentin Queiros will show us an impressive global data set of seabird foraging trip characteristics.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's fine. So, hi everyone. Thank you for this introduction. So, my name is Quentin Queiros. I'm doing a postdoc at SLU with Astrid Carlsen here and Jonas Sundberg. And today I will talk a bit about my project on the prediction of the foraging trips for the world seabird and how we try to do that. So, as you know, seabirds are a bird species for which a large proportion of their population rely on the marine environment. And for example, during the reproduction period, during that period, seabirds are central place foragers, which means that they commit once or several times a day or a week from the colony to the foraging areas. And the foraging depends on many, many variables. So, for example, the seabird species, the diving or the flying styles, the morphological traits, the colony size, period, year, sex, and so on. As a result, the foraging can vary. The foraging range can vary between coastal and pelagic areas up to more than 2,000 kilometers from the colony. And as you know, seabirds are written both at sea and on land. And on the top of the list, we can find the climate change, invasive species, and the commercial fishing. There are also growing threats, such as the pollution, diseases, and overfishing. And all these threats can have both direct and indirect impact on the seabirds population. Unfortunately, these threats have already significant impact on the seabirds population. Indeed, the seabirds population have declined by 70% during the last 5 decades, leading to the poorest conservation status for the seabird species. Breeding sites are well known, but the foraging areas are poorly understood. But understanding such areas is essential for the implementation of the marine protected areas and for the conservation purposes. To do so, we can use logger, for example, Argos, GPS, and geolocators. And here it's just an example of how they used the loggers to identify and to see the effects of the closure to fishing on the foraging effort and the breeding success of a population in South Africa. However, the study effort is unbalanced. On the left, you can see. So on the left, you have the albatrosses. So for them, there is a lot of track species and a lot of tracks. On the other hand, you have the cormorants and the pelicans, for which we have less percentage of tracked species and less amount of tracks for them. So for my postdoc, we would like to try to use the well-studied species to predict the foraging trips for the unstudied species. So to do so, we have compiled available tracking data from different databases. We also need explanatory variables to be able to link the foraging trips. And then the final step was to develop very simple allometric equation to be able to predict the foraging trip for the unstudied species. So first, we have downloaded tracking data from two databases. The first one was the movement database. This database was coordinated by the Max Planck Institute, and the datasets are downloadable without any request. And the other one is the Seabird tracking database, so datasets can be downloaded after a requesting from the data owner. And this one is coordinated by the BirdLife International. We managed to collect 326 datasets for 79 species. Using those datasets, we were able to extract some foraging features, and for my postdoc, we focused on the maximal distance from the colony, and we managed to extract around 14,000 tracks and 40,000 distance from the colony. Then we need some variables, and we have extracted morphological traits from the AVONET database, and we have included the wing length, the secondary length, the end wing index. We have also performed a PCA to extract the two first components from a PCA on the morphological traits to extract the two first components. And we have also calculated 3 additional morphological parameters, so the wing area, the wing loading, and the aspect ratio. We would like also to include the phylogenetic tree. I'm going to talk a bit about that later. And we would like also to include the flying diving style. So you have for the flying style, we can from the gliders, like the albatrosses, to the non-flying birds. And finally, the aim was to develop an allometric equation. And here we focused on the log of the maximal distance from the colony. We used a phylogenetically informed model to take into account the phylogenetic autocorrelation, for example, for the morphological traits. And we used a Bayesian approach, quite similar to the analysis used by Peterson on guillemots in the North Atlantic. But here, focusing on 10 seabirds families, we first compare 4 distribution for the parameter of our Bayesian model, and then we run and compare a series of models. So I'm still running model, so it's only the preliminary results today. So here you have our best model right now. So you have the foraging range on the y-axis and the wing length on the x-axis. So we found that the log distance was linked to the wing length of seabirds. That's not new. Based on our estimation, so the foraging range varies between 30 kilometers for the Lytton penguin and to more than 200 kilometers for the Tristan albatross. And as you can see, there is an increase of the foraging range with the wing length. Well, it's a well-known fact. Long-winged seabirds are able to forage in both coastal and pelagic areas. What about the outliers? As you know, all models are not perfect, and we have some outliers. So on the top of the graph, we have two outliers, two petrel species, the Juan Fernandez petrel and the Murphy's petrel. But we know that these seabirds are high aspect ratio, and they are able to transform their food into oil, reducing the foraging cost. So we underestimate the foraging trip for this species. On the other hand, we have here two seagull species, the European earring and the Undwin's gull, that are known to interact with human activities and seabirds' colonies. So they have to remain close to their colony to be able to forage. And we have also cormorants. They are known to be food prepper divers with high cost of flying or swimming activities. So there are constraints on their foraging abilities. What about the extrapolation to other seabird species? So for auks, boobies, frigate birds, gulls, pelicans, penguins, and tropic birds, we are within the range of the observed values. We are within the lower pots for albatrosses and petrel, but we clearly underestimate the foraging trips of northern and southern storm petrels. On the other hand, we overestimate the foraging trips of squaws and cormorants. What would you like to do next? So first, I have collected and I have compiled information on a lot of seabirds colonies around the world using available database and using the Global Seabird Data Portal. Then we would like to extrapolate the foraging range that we have estimated to all colonies. And finally, we would like to compare our predictions to current MPAs and IBAS to be able to identify less protected species, families, or colonies, and to be able to identify priority area for conservation efforts. So the take-home message of my talk today is that by compiling several available databases and by building phylogenetically informed model, we were able to link the foraging range to the wing lengths of seabirds, and we would like to identify the main areas for future conservation efforts. I would like to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to present my work today. I will also would like to thank all co-authors and data providers. Without their data, my study will not happen. So thank you very much. And it's very important for me to share your data, so please do not hesitate to share your data. And if you have any questions, feedbacks, comments, we can talk now or later during the coffee breaks. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Quentin. We have now time for 2 questions. One here.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a really neat idea. You said that the reason for the 2 outliers, the pterodroma petrels, was their aspect ratio. I just wondered what the relationship looks like if you just look at aspect ratio of all of the seabirds.
So we're still running models, so maybe the aspect ratio can come with the analysis, but yeah, we're still waiting for more model to run. It takes time.
Hi, Quentin. Thanks for the talk. How much of the unexplained variability do you think might be driven by the link from colony size to foraging range?
We don't know. I mean, I really don't know. That's a good question. to be able to assess the impact or the effect of the colony size, we need to have this information for all the data set I have. So I think it's a very different postdoc, but it's definitely something that we would like. I mean, it's something that we included in our model because we have data from very many different locations in the world. So, I mean, it's like, I think we already included that information in our model. Not directly, but indirectly, because we have a lot of data.
Okay, thank you, Quentin.
Thank you.
And now, before the coffee break, Oliver Padget will tell us about the role of competition in explaining seabird distributions. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Which is, hello. Yeah, I'm Ollie Padget. What I want to talk about today is asymmetric competition in birds, and I want to discuss some nuances about how it may or may not result in some of the distributions that we observe in nature. Specifically, I'm going to talk about diffuse competition, where interactions between competitors are via prey depletion. So as you all know, we see segregated animal distributions commonly in nature, and here are some examples of factors that animals might segregate by. So if there are different commuting costs, so that neighbouring colonies can get to resources, then we might observe foraging segregation, but we also see segregation that can't be explained by commuting distance as well, such as by age or by sex, or during differential migration, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Okay, so in this talk I'm going to concentrate on the cases of segregation that can't be explained by travelling costs, because in these cases, where animals go appears to be not determined by the relative abundance of resource, and this means that we might describe this as an apparent departure from an ideal free distribution. So in its simplest form, an ideal free distribution should have evolved, animals should have evolved to make ideal free decisions about where to forage. For example, if we feed the ducks at two different ends of a park lake, at site A and site B, and we feed them at different rates, then we expect the number of ducks recruiting to sites A and site B at the different ends of the lake to be proportional to the amount of food that's available, as each duck looks at the amount of food available, the amount of competitors it must compete with, and then chooses the patch that has the highest payoff. And so if we include distance into this decision, and we assume that animals pay an energetic cost or a time cost to travel further, then ideal free behaviour can result in segregation even between relatively close colonies. And this has been really nicely shown by the density-dependent hinterland model by Wakefield and Bodie et al. And essentially, this is where high levels of intraspecific competition in areas that are equidistant between islands can be escaped by individuals if they move in opposite directions, given that they pay higher commuting costs to go in the same to go towards the other colony. But segregation also happens within populations, and this is perhaps a little bit harder to explain. So these are just a couple of examples. So this is an example in little penguins, where you have distinct foraging areas between middle-aged and older, potentially senescing penguins. And this is an example of Mount Shearwaters that I normally work on, with immature birds foraging in different areas to establish breeders. So these are immature birds that visit the colony in the years before they start breeding. And in this case, the immature birds are going to areas that are less profitable at sea. There are also some examples of this stuff during migration too. So just from the seabird realm, this is just an example of gannets, different sexes from Bass Rock, migrating different distances down the West African coast. And so just to be really clear, so what I'm going to talk about today is whether asymmetric diffuse competition can explain these intrapopulation segregations. And I just want to be clear that the studies that I've just highlighted don't necessarily claim that. They're just examples of the segregation I'm talking about. But these are some quotes from papers that suggest that actually it's quite a widely suggested mechanism by which these within population segregations can occur. So this suggests that immatures were competitively excluded from this area. Spatial segregation is one of the possible responses to an imbalanced competition. Dominance, where one sex is competitively excluded from a particular area, you sort of see what I mean. But I just want to remind you that diffuse competition is where individuals compete via the depletion of resource, and so I want to think a little bit about whether that can work. And so if we think about what this implies, it implies that we've got two phenotypes in the population, and that one is a superior competitor to the other. So here I've drawn this as a big Manx shearwater, which eats lots of fish, and a little Manx shearwater that eats fewer fish. And the big Manx shearwater might be bigger, it might be more skilled, it might have more experience, or it might be larger. But it's quite hard to imagine how this improved competitive ability can result in the segregation for which it's often claimed to. So if we revisit our duck scenario in the park, but now we have two types of duck. We have a big duck, which consumes lots, and a little duck that consumes less. Then regardless of whether big ducks or small ducks have, you can ignore sex, by the way, of the ducks, that's just a red herring. But regardless of whether big ducks or small ducks have recruited previously, the rank, i.e. which patch has the higher payoff, should be the same regardless of whether the duck that is currently recruiting is a big competitive duck or a small, less competitive duck. There's more food for either of the phenotype in the same place. So to go back to differential migration, this is also another case where diffuse asymmetric composition might be used to explain animal segregation. So in the case of both leapfrog migration and chain migration, what we essentially have that's hard to explain is birds traveling further than areas that we know are suitable. They're evidently suitable because other conspecifics spend the winter there to spend their non-breeding period. And so the question here is, why do these populations not compete equally and fill up available habitat according to ideal free rules? So again, just to have an example from seabirds, chain migration is known in gannets. So this just shows that gannets that are beginning migration, having bred at different latitudes, have relatively similar migratory distances. Again, this paper doesn't necessarily use that to explain it. And then here's an example in swifts. And so again, birds that are breeding at higher latitudes are wintering at higher latitudes again. So this is another example of chain migration. And to go into a bit more detail about the explanation that is given for swift migration, the idea is that there's a resource gradient. I've sort of drawn this on the left. And that with the resources being better further south in sub-Saharan Africa, and that you have an example of reverse Bergman's rule in swift, which is true. So swifts in southern Europe are larger than swifts in northern Europe. And so asymmetric competition between these large southerly swifts means that the larger birds go to the best habitat further south, and then they displace the smaller birds that arrive, so they don't go as far south and they end up foraging on poorer resource. Again, competition entirely diffuse. And so let's just have a little think about how that might work. So if you've got the number of competitors on the x-axis, and you've got a newcomer's potential profitability or intake rate from going to that area, that's going to decrease as competitors increase. And it's going to decrease at different rates depending on whether there are already bigger birds or smaller birds, assuming that bigger birds eat more or eat more quickly. So this reduction would presumably be steeper if competitors are bigger and more skilled and able to consume insects faster, like I was saying. So if we imagine the simplest case where there are two patches which have different resource qualities, and then there are 20 equal competitors, in this case consuming one resource per unit time, if individuals maximize the available prey divided by the current patch competitor number, then 20 individuals should recruit approximately with 4 in the poor area and 16 in the good area, like our ducks. But if we introduce two competitive levels, with one consuming resource at twice the rate, then maximizing the available prey per current patch competitor, so the same maximand, the same decision-making process, such as those that essentially what you have is multiple solutions to the same problem now. But what these solutions don't do is cause highly competitive birds to be in one patch and less competitive birds to be in another patch. So hence on its own, it seems that the asymmetry doesn't drive segregation. Ideal free foragers don't seem to segregate according to this mechanism. So we can extend this simple model to the case of a choice of 10 wintering sites, which differ in their latitude and distance from 10 breeding sites. And here we can assume that patch resource potential improves further south, like swifts, and each animal in turn chooses a patch and recruits to the patch with the best current payoff, given its quality divided by the competitors already present, multiplied by their competitive ability, which depends on their latitudinal origin. But as you can see, actually, you don't end up with systematic variation in the wintering latitude depending on the origin of the birds. But what happens if the different origin populations have different resource requirements? And so if we imagine that actually what we've got is a sort of low resource tolerance difference between the populations. So if you imagine that big swifts, the blue ones, need more resource than small swifts, then they might have a different leave rule. And so if we allow birds to re-choose their patch once the rate of intake falls below a threshold, then this varies by origin population, then immediately we do observe a sort of chain migration type segregation. And so it seems that populations' abilities to withstand lower resource density rather than inferior competitive ability might be key to determining these kind of segregation patterns. And so just to wrap up, why does it seem counterintuitive that more dominant birds shouldn't monopolize better resources? Because it inevitably does. And this is perhaps because we as people model competition as though it's aggression mediated, even in cases where it's not. So this is a hypothetical case where woodpeckers migrate and woodpecker size follows the same pattern as the swift I was talking about. And they want to go and they spend the winter in a hole in a tree, and that hole quality increases as you go further south. Now, if arriving there first makes you better able to defend a good hole, or being bigger allows you to evict another woodpecker from a hole, then absolutely we might see this kind of chain migration evolve. But in this case, this is relying on asymmetric despotic competition rather than diffuse competition. So this is competition with aggression. So just to summarize, I think what I'm saying is that asymmetric competition is probably a feature of despotic competition and not diffuse competition. That the type of competition really matters and how we model it really matters and what we think is actually going on. And that segregation of birds by sex, age, or population is more likely to be explained by niche differences or resource requirement tolerances than by sort of what we might think of classically as competitive exclusion. And this is kind of pertinent to seabird competition because there's a little bit of fighting at sea, but I think by and large, seabird competition is thought to be diffuse. And that's all I'm going to say.